This video is part of the series on the Canadian political system, and in this one I am going to focus on this area which connects the people most directly to the legislature, namely elections. And I'm going to talk about basic properties of the electoral system. I'm going to talk about campaigns on the national and local level and election funding, and I will finish with some words on political participation and turnout and such. First of all then, basic properties of this electoral system. It is a first-past-the-post system, which means that each riding, each constituency, each district is a single member, so there is a single person who will win the election in that constituency and be sent to Parliament. The winner, the member of Parliament, has a maximum of 5 years in term, depending on whether the Prime Minister wants to trigger an election earlier or not. And the first-past-the-post system does have some properties that has given rise to quite a few rounds of critique. One being false majorities. The winning party tends to be overrepresented, which can produce a majority in Parliament, and that majority, of course, is important to retain the confidence to get bills passed and so on. That also means that other parties tend to be underrepresented. Regional parties can also become overrepresented, and a good historical example of that is the Bloc Québécois that managed to tap into the regional support in Quebec for representation. Parties with diffuse support, on the other hand, diffuse support across the entire country, tends to be underrepresented. So the Greens are an excellent example of that. They are popular all over the country. They have supporters all over the country, but they are spread out between ridings, which means that they're unlikely to win any single riding. That means that even though they can poll fairly decent numbers in terms of popular support, they very rarely have a chance at actually sending someone to the House of Commons. So that's a source of frustration for their supporters. It also means that that it's prudent for political parties to ignore certain regions of the country. If they feel that they don't have a chance to win in a riding, there is no reason for them to spend time doing campaigning there. Another reason why this system has been critiqued is the phenomenon of wasted votes, where voter goes to the ballot box and votes for a candidate that does not win. Then that voter probably feels that the vote has been wasted, and this can give rise to a sense of alienation within the voter and the sense of not feeling represented by the politician that is ostensibly represents the riding. So to remedy this, there have been quite a few rounds of talks about electoral reform in the country, where proportional representation, so-called PR, is set up as an alternative. The goal with this electoral system is to have the party's share of seats after elections match its share of the popular vote more closely, because that is experienced, so say the advocates of this, that is a more fair outcome than what first-past-the-post system would produce. Even though no substantial attempt has been done on the national level to change the electoral system yet, there have been some attempts on local level or regional level. For instance, BC had a discussion about changing the electoral system on provincial level, which failed ultimately, but was very close to succeeding. And the system that was discussed there was so-called MMP, mixed member plurality, which exists in New Zealand, another former British colony that is built on the Westminster system. So there actually was a change from first-past-the-post to something more proportional. Anyone who's interested in electoral reform, I'd encourage using New Zealand, exploring the New Zealand example to see how that can work and what possible differences and similarities there might be between Canada and New Zealand. Moving on to campaigns. A campaign will take place on both the national and the local level. Political parties will prepare in all sorts of various ways and plan their strategy. They have to think about budgets, because of course an electoral campaign costs a lot of money. They have to think about fundraising and how to pay for that campaign. They have to have candidates in all the ridings and decide where candidates should be running. And of course, one strategy has been sometimes to put candidates that are not seen as winners in ridings where the party doesn't expect to win. This is actually an issue for female candidates who are often put in ridings where the party don't think that they can win. So then the party says that they do have female candidates, but because of how candidates are selected and so on, the candidate actually can't win that place. And thus you get this situation in the House of Commons where female parliamentarians are underrepresented compared to their male counterparts. There's also, of course, the whole issue of the logistics, organizational staffing or preparation. The strategy itself is coordinated nationally. There has to be a party platform, policies, promises, priorities, all that has to, every candidate across the country has to stay on message. And the party leader will tour across the country and target key areas where the race is close, but there is a chance of winning, and to create publicity and photo ops. And these are really meant very symbolic to produce the idea, the image that the party leader is in touch with the Canadian public in all walks of life. Of course, this, in reality, the leader has very little knowledge of these ridings because it's a 1 hour stop or 2 hour stop. So in reality, all this could have been done in front of a green screen instead of the considerable expense in monies and carbon fuel exhausts to go all across the country. But it does create an image that the parties are very keen on upholding. So that's why the tradition goes on. Media, of course, plays a key role in this. Parties want a positive media coverage, and therefore you will find that the parties have a staff who know media and media strategy very well. This is the role of spin or political marketing, both in terms of advertising, which is regulated through the election acts, what can be done and how it can be paid for and so on, how much each party can access in terms of advertising time, but also in terms of the televised leader debates, which are really the prime time of the entire election because it has such a outreach into the public. So this is always a special focus. The local campaign is also important, of course, which begins with a candidate nomination. And here the party elite can be very important. The party leader does have the power to veto representation in local ridings and will do so if there is a feeling that the local candidate isn't towing the party line sufficiently. Once the party elite is satisfied, the team is assembled to organize and manage this candidate's individual campaign. And this will be through a mix of both paid staff and volunteers, through social media and a personal website, and a lot of canvassing, of course, and those lawn signs and so on. And this local candidate will have to try and satisfy voter needs and what is currently expressed as popular within the local riding, while at the same time towing the party line and defending that consistently. So even at the start here in the local campaign, there is a tension between being the trustee of the local constituency and being loyal to the party, because party loyalty and party discipline is an important part of the Westminster system. Election funding is regulated in Canada. The country didn't have any effective laws about this for quite a long time, but there were some scandals that changed that, and legislation was passed in 1974 to regulate spending. The objectives then of the federal election finance law was to increase equity, transparency, and participation in electoral systems with 4 basic provisions: a ceiling on national party and candidate expenditure, disclosure for contributions over $100, and income tax credit given to contributors, and also some subsidizing of public funds to political parties depending on voter support. Now, introducing such regulation on what how large sums can be contributed directly to a political party, and thus how much funding a political party has access to, meant that parties took steps to circumvent the legislation in some ways. And this is fairly easily done. All you have to do, instead of paying for your own ad, you can have a third party, someone who is allied to the party but isn't the political party, do the spending instead. And this type of advertising grew in the 1980s, and that created another reaction to legislate the limit the amount that third parties could spend on election advertising. These are still activities engaged during the election. It's quite clear because we had 55 third parties registered for advertising in the 2011 election. There have been new legislation introduced over the last decade. So you have the 2004 legislation about corporate union and individual donations, and the Harper government's elimination of corporate and union donations with the Federal Accountability Act. So this is, in short, an area that has been up for debate since the 70s, and governments will keep addressing the issue of election funding. Finally, a note on political participation. We can talk about two forms. This is about turnout and so on. Participating politically is not just putting a ballot in a box. There are many other ways of doing it. So this is non-electoral participation, which also happens during elections. So people can volunteer in advocacy groups or participate in demonstrations or sign petitions or volunteer for a political party. And all of these will happen during an election campaign because it's a particular flashpoint in politics where TV cameras are more available, when the public consciousness about politics is raised. So it's an excellent time for every stakeholder in politics to try to get their message across and try to influence political parties and decision makers. So all of this form of participation will also increase during elections. But the most common form of participation, certainly electoral participation, is voting. This has in fact decreased. Turnout to elections have decreased since 1988. And that's not just in Canada, but in all democracies. And that's not just in Canada, it's even in countries with proportional representation. We see an overall decrease in all democracies in voter turnout, but countries with first-past-the-post type of systems had lower electoral turnout to begin with than proportional representation countries had. So the decrease in countries like Canada or the United States have actually led to even lower participation rates, so 60s and so on, 60% turnouts and so on. And there is quite a bit of concern about what, in international perspective, is actually fairly low turnout rates and participation rates, and how to turn that trend. There's a whole set of factors influencing how a voter that actually turns up at the ballot box will vote. There's socio-demographic characteristics. As much as we would like to believe in the rational voter who makes an deeply informed decision, the position of our parents and what we were taught by them, and the social position and conditions that we have been brought up in, is very often a good indicator of how we will vote. People from the upper class tend to vote more right. People from the lower class tend to vote more left. This is not deterministic, but it's a fairly good indicator, generally speaking. There's also core beliefs and values, and of course, political parties are even organized very much on values: conservatism, liberalism, socialism, and so on. Party identification is also important. How loyal a person is to a political party will have an importance, even if the party changes its stance on some things, and sometimes maybe is promising things that might not correspond to core beliefs and values. A person who is deeply loyal to the party will keep voting and supporting that party, even though the platform might not look the same as it did 10 years previously. Other people who are not as loyal to the party might decide that change was enough to switch support to some other party. Current issues and economic performance should never be discounted, particularly when the economic times are bad. The government's record, this is something that can also come into play, and if you listen to how governments talk, they tend, particularly if they've been in power for a long time, actually tend to play up their record over their values sometimes. The Liberal government, after being in power for a decade, would have run on in saying, we're excellent managers of government affairs. We have 10 years of experience of this, and therefore you should re-elect us because we know how to manage a government and the opposition does not. They are incompetent klutzes and they will just make a mess of the whole thing. So stay with us. We are tried and tested. Of course, you will hear similar things from the current government when election times come. They will also discuss their long experience of managing government affairs and so on. So this is not really related to ideology or values. It has to do with how long the government has been in power. The longer they've been in power, the more they will play up their managerial skills. The impact of party leaders is unclear, but there is some. And of course, we had examples of that in the Liberal Party when Dion and Ignatieff were both axed because they were experienced as weak leaders or leaders with less than stellar charisma. So the Liberal Party sought a new leader with stronger leadership skills and more charisma. And of course, Harper, also seen as a leader without that much charisma, he was often compared to a robot, and maybe still is by some, but he won elections. He was able to stay as a party leader, even in spite of this early critique. A final piece here, strategic voting. This is particularly significant in first past the post systems. If you have 3 different parties, you really like party 3, but you as a voter, but you know that party number 3 has no realistic chance of winning in this riding, it's then very likely that you will engage in strategic voting and vote for the least bad of party 1 and party 2 just to keep the worst option from winning in your riding. That's called strategic voting, and it's voting not according to your core beliefs. It's voting just to not have your least favorite party winning that seat. That happens more often in first past the post voting than in proportional representation, and that's also a reason why third parties or parties with diffuse support over the country have an even bigger issue, even bigger barrier to winning the riding. So that sums up an overview of how elections are run in Canada. I hope you found it useful.